Thank you very much, Joseph, and certainly a very different example from the first one, and one that presents different challenges. One of the challenges of your institution is certainly is the size of the restoration involved, which makes it very difficult, especially when it comes to raising funds. And the approach of step-by-step restructuring is probably the most wise one. Let me come to the last speaker for this first panel, and before I do that, I just want to announce that we probably have time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience. So if you have some curiosities, or if you want to dig a deeper into one of our cases, please start thinking about your questions. The last speaker for this first panel is Mr. Evert Verhagen. I hope I am pronouncing it right. Is the founder of Creative Cities and is being personally involved in very interesting projects all around the world, which are an example of what we're talking about. So I hope that, well, actually, I know that you are not going to speak about one particular example, but you're going to present us with methodology on how to actually tackle this kind of projects, right? Great. Thank you.
Buonasera, scusa, ma non è possibile per me di fare questa presentazione in italiano, ma I will speak English, but thank you for inviting me, and yes, I will talk a little bit about the projects that I worked on, and I will talk a little bit about the things that already have been discussed during the first presentations we heard today. I have given the name to my presentation, Transformation. And before I proceed, I think it's important for you to understand that I am a project manager. I work in projects. The project that I am going to talk about, which started my career, so to say, was in 1990. And after finishing that project, I started my own company, Creative Cities. And I don't have a research institute. I'm not a professor. I don't work with large groups of people. So the conclusions that I'm going to give you, the ideas that I'm going to give you, are completely based on my own experiences in different projects all over the world. And I want to tell you a little bit about myself. This is where I was born. And when I was 20, I went to Amsterdam, and where I was born is in the south of the Netherlands, a farm. And then I went to Amsterdam to the Bijlmermeer, and the Bijlmermeer is a modernist suburb of Amsterdam. And in 1990, I went to the city, and I started to do this Westergasfabriek project. And I will talk a little bit about the Westergasfabriek project. I could talk about this project for, let's say, 2 hours, but that will certainly not be possible, so I will try to give you the highlights. And the most important thing, I think, with all these projects that we are discussing is that we are in this transformation of the industrial age to a more post-industrial, or you can say creative, or you can say tourism, or whatever you can say, age. We don't know the name yet. We are in a crisis, and I think that the crisis marks this very important barrier between going from this one period into the other period. And all these projects that I have seen and that we have been discussing this afternoon have some comparable elements. One of the elements is, for instance, that very often the projects that we have to work with have beautiful architecture. So this gas factory that I worked on in Amsterdam in the 90s was beautiful architecture with all the buildings on the monument list, but no one knew who the architect was. Because this architect, he made only industrial buildings, like the Heineken brewery. You all know Heineken, but no one knows who made the building, because the building changed over the years and it no longer exists, the original Heineken building. This gas factory is the only place that still exists of this architect. The architect was named Goschalk, by the way. Beautiful buildings, but a horrible affair. A gas factory is not a nice place to work. When we see it today, or it's the same with your cigarette factory, you think, oh, beautiful, very nice, and maybe also with the hospital. But in reality, at the gas factory, most people that worked there died because there was a lot of pollution. There were pucks, there was cyanide. It was a very dirty, heavy affair. When I arrived in 1990 at the gas factory, the buildings were still standing there, but they were already empty for 20 years. The buildings had been in neglect, and they were used by the electricity and the gas company to store their pipes and their lamps and their cables. But in 1990, the city started to understand that maybe something else had to be done. And I worked for this city department in Westergasfabriek, and they asked me to do the project. It was pure coincidence. So I went on the site, 13 hectares. I looked at the buildings, and I started to ask myself, wow, what can we do with this beautiful area? 13 hectares, 15,000 square meters of buildings, and also very beautiful from the inside, large open spaces. And I have to tell you, at the other side of the street was the largest concentration of squatters. You know, in Amsterdam, they invented house squatting. And I knew, because I had been more or less in that squatting movement myself, that if we were going to leave these buildings empty for one day, they would be occupied by squatters. Because my political board also, they were from the left parties, and they were never going to use the police to throw out these squatters. So I had to come up with a solution. And the solution that I thought up was to temporarily use the buildings. So we started to rent out the buildings. And we were thinking, okay, what can we use the buildings for? And the most easy thing to do on a temporary basis was culture. Cultural activities, like people who make movies. Peter Greenaway used the buildings to build a set for one of his movies. We used artists to rent the buildings. We started to organize events. And this temporary use gave me the time, the years that I needed to make a real plan. Because there had to be made a real plan. The buildings had to be restored, 25 million euros. The soil had to be remediated, also 25 million euros. And there had to be a park. The neighborhood, the people living there were promised a park. Already 100 years before the gas factory, they were promised a park. And now it was the time to fulfill that promise and build a park there. So I needed more or less between 80 and 100 million euros, and there was not 1 cent. There was a fence and a lot of problems. So we started to do this temporary use, and this temporary use was in many ways very important. And I really want to stress this point, how important this is, because you learn the place by doing. We see very many projects where people hire architects and engineers and wait for 5 years and make plans and other plans, and we try to find the money. It doesn't work. Start with temporary use. Start with experiments. That's much more important, because when you learn to know these industrial buildings, when you try to find out which activities work in the buildings, what kind of public can you attract, that is much more important. Because I always try to stress this very important point, I think. It's not about what there is, it's about what happens. It's about what's going on. You cannot attract people only by physical buildings. You attract people with other people, with activities, with being invitive, with being attractive. And that is so important. So let's think about the program first. Okay, I had 5 years of temporary use, and this gave me the time to find a solution for the remediation, to find a solution to build a park. We did a very long, we had a very long search for the right landscape architect with a competition. And in the end, we started after, let's say, 7, 8 years, we started to build the park and restore the buildings. And I had been very optimistic. I thought that this all could be done in 1 or 2 years. But when we started to dig, we really started to dig in the polluted soil there, we found out that things were far worse than ever was expected. So it took us 4 years to build this whole park, and another 2 years to restore all the buildings. And today, it's a beautiful park. And one of the things that I also want to mention, that temporary use and all these temporary events learned us, is that it gave us the necessary information for the park architect as well as for the building architect, what to do and what not to do. Because you are transforming an industrial place into a place for the future, and you do not exactly know what the future is going to bring. So it's very important to find out how people walk, how people react. And one of the important things that I learned is basically on social safety. These industrial buildings are always very close to the outside. And we learned that if we want to have an attractive park and we have these cultural activities inside the buildings, it's very important to have large windows so people can see each other. And because of these big windows, the big openings we made into these industrial buildings, we now find today that many people want to use the park also in the evening to do a run or to do something, because they feel safe with the cultural activities like a fashion show or whatever you can think of, a car presentation, a meeting, a movie presentation, whatever. So the park is much more used when you think about the right combination with the buildings. Okay, today it's a very successful place, and I stopped working there in 2005. I don't know, do I still have 10 minutes? Yep. Okay, that's good, and I can go on with my rest of my talk. And then I went, invited by the mayor of Amsterdam to Casablanca. And Casablanca is not Amsterdam. Casablanca is not Barcelona. Casablanca is not Linz. Casablanca is Morocco. And that's, we say, is a different cook, we say in the Netherlands. That's completely a different thing. And the mayor of Casablanca, he told me that there is an old abattoir and a slaughterhouse and everything that was alive except people was killed there, like dromedaris, donkey, horse, pig. Yes, in Morocco also pigs, because there were a lot of French people and they wanted to eat their ham. And a beautiful, beautiful complex, 20,000 square meters, but there are earthquakes in Casablanca, so part of the buildings had collapsed and there had been a fire, but the buildings were beautiful. And the buildings were also very nicely situated. And the mayor of Casablanca had a French architect, and he had made a plan. And the plan was to restore the buildings, and that would cost 35 million euros. And I was asked to help him to find the money. And I said to him, Mr. Mayor, I cannot do that for you. Instead, I think we should start to do something different tomorrow. You have to find, let's say, 200, 300,000 euros, and we use a small corner, maybe 2 or 3 buildings of your complex, and we invite every creative Moroccan artist we can find in this city. They have 5 million inhabitants. Half of them is younger than 18. And we did that. He allowed me to do that. And after a year, we had the opening festival. We had the opening festival, and he was thinking that he needed a theater. But I was thinking, when I walked around in Casablanca and when I saw what was going on at the opening festival, that this city doesn't need Chekhov or Shakespeare. That the culture of this Islamic city is completely different. They dance in circles, they do completely different things. The art is different. So with respect to what the local culture is, you can develop a place on the basis of that. Now, today, he still did not find, I think the mayor is gone. There is another mayor. It's very hard in a country like Casablanca, in a country like Morocco, because basically the King Hassan is the boss. And if the king doesn't like it, it doesn't happen. And so today still it is not restored. There are still temporary activities, and this is already for 4 or 5 years. But why do I tell you this story about Casablanca in comparison to Amsterdam? Because I think that these kind of projects have to happen everywhere. And why do they have to happen everywhere? This is what I have to make clear, I think, on the basis of this picture. It's about cities. More and more people in this new age choose to live in cities. There's an enormous migration of people from the land to the city. But there is also a big migration from cities to other cities. In Europe, for instance, in Amsterdam, I meet a lot of Italian young people. And they say, I always think, Italy is a beautiful country, the best food, beautiful language, nice clothes, fantastic people. What are you doing here? In the cold, in the rain, in Amsterdam? And many of them tell me, yeah, I'm looking for a job, I'm looking for a new future. I don't think Milan, Venezia, Bologna, all these places can offer that for me. So what I experience, and the same thing, by the way, in Russia or in many other countries, where a lot of young people between 20 and 35 are looking for these new opportunities. So there is not only migration from the land to the city, but there is also a lot of migration from the city to the other city. In the Netherlands, we have shrinking cities. In Italy, in the south, you have shrinking cities. In Britain, in the north, they have shrinking cities. In Germany, in the east, they have shrinking cities. So the question is, that I want to pose, why do these young people choose to go from one place to the other? Because if we know that, if we know how to make our cities attractive for them, we can have successful projects. And we can have successful cities. And we can survive in the future. We can be sustainable. We can be all these things that are needed. But when everybody is going to the big city, and all these other places, half of them are collapsing, then I think we are in big trouble, because it's not sustainable. So my point is, the future is for the medium-sized cities. And if we do these regeneration projects, what better can we do than use these projects to make our cities more attractive? And for whom are we going to make them attractive? That is the question. Because very often, the projects are made for tourists. And of course, tourism, we have a lot of tourism in Amsterdam, can be very interesting. But we already heard the people from Barcelona say that too many tourists is no longer nice. I was, the day before yesterday, talking to a 22-year-old girl from the north of Italy who studied in Venice. And she said, yeah, I lived for 3 years in Venice, but there are absolutely no possibilities for me in Venice as an urbanist. What can I do there? I cannot stay there. So this tourism, the tourists bring money, and we should use that money to make our cities more attractive and to make them competitive. But the main people we need are the people who are going to do new economy, new jobs. So this place, this picture that I have here is for me to tell you that a lot of this theory about making our cities more attractive comes from people like Richard Florida, Charles Landry. We've heard a lot about that. And they say that there is a creative economy and a creative class. I don't believe in the creative class. I don't believe in the creative economy. What I believe in is in the creatification of the economy. And that is to say that more and more important in our economy is the added value of the identity, the story that goes with the product. And I think that is best shown with the Apple, because this iPhone costs to make it as much as a Samsung or any other iPhone, any other mobile telephone. But most people who buy a thing like this, they want to pay 5 or 6 times as much as the value, because they want to have this identity of Apple. And this is why Apple is the biggest profit-making company in the world today. So they have learned this trick immensely well. But we all do it with our clothes, with our food. The added value of the story is very important. And the point I want to make is that the people who add this value can work everywhere. They do not have to produce a product in a factory. They can do their job everywhere. And where do they do their job? In attractive cities. So which cities have all these people, all these businesses, all these startups, all these app factories? The attractive cities. So the thing that I really want to put here is that if we are thinking about Modena, and if we are really thinking about having projects here, transforming projects, the main thing we have to think about, what is our program going to be, and who is going to work there, who are we going to attract? And it's not the creative class, it's the talented young people that we need. That is the point that I want to make. And the last slide that I have to show this is this one. This is a slide of migration in the Netherlands. And what you see here in one axis is a percentage, and in the other axis is age. And this slide, this graph, is almost the same in every country. Although I tried to find this one for Italy, and it was very hard because there are not so very good numbers on movement of people in Italy. It's a bit slower here, this information, than, for instance, in the Netherlands or in the USA. But usually the graphs are the same. And this graph shows that 12% of the people of a certain area move from one place to another when they are 25 years old. Above 40, only 2% moves. Yeah? So think about this. When the amount starts to grow, is between 12 and 20. It sounds very logical to me, because most people move to a city to have opportunities to emancipate, for education, to make their lives better. Then when they have finished their study, they are still moving, but above 40, they don't move. Then they become tourists. And what do we do with our projects? We focus our projects on the people above 40. We shouldn't do that. We have to think about talented young people. When we do projects, we have to think about talented young people. And in my opinion, this should not only be culture. Culture can be very important, but it can be many other things. It can be production, it can be co-creation, it can be sport, it can be many other things, but we have to focus on this group. And this is why I think that, and what I have learned, looking at all these projects and all these people in Bilbao, in Amsterdam Park, and all these places that I've met, and all these young people that I have talked to, that the most successful projects that I have seen in the world have done exactly that. They focused on that group, They help them to emancipate, they help them to meet, they create market spaces, and this is when they become successful. So we have to create places where people can meet, and we have to create places where people can emancipate, and we have to create places that are attractive. And this is what I like to tell you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There was a thought-provoking presentation with a few key points that I personally bring home, including the fact that when you have a building and you need to understand what identity to give to the building rather than imposing it top-down, try to live it for a while and see what comes out, what emerges out of it, which I think it's a very good source of inspiration. Now, I've got time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience. Ci sono domande dal pubblico? Ok, questo ci dà anche la possibilità di rispettare maggiormente i tempi e passare al secondo panel. I'd like to thank you, our 4 speakers, for the first panel. Thank you very much.